Hi, my name is Irene Hurford, and yeah, I'm just going to start. I really don't think I need to introduce myself because I think the talk does that anyway. But I will say I'm very nervous for this talk, which is interesting because I give a lot of talks that I'm not nervous for, so I think this probably means something that I'm nervous for this one. During the 13th year of an otherwise unremarkable childhood, I read the novel I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. In the book, which was really a memoir that was disguised as fiction, a young girl suffers a long psychotic break. She's hospitalized for years, and during that time, she's treated with psychoanalysis. She recovers. I was enraptured. I was fascinated that someone's experience of reality could differ so much from true reality, and that words had the power to heal. I read that book multiple times over several years, and so began my undying intellectual interest in psychosis and its treatment. I went to medical school with the express purpose of becoming a schizophrenia researcher and clinician. I did indeed become that. I was faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. I developed a first episode psychosis program for Philadelphia, and then a Pennsylvania-wide center for first episode psychosis training and programming. And then I left the University of Pennsylvania, research, academia, and started a private practice where I see mostly people who have or have had psychosis. And I started analytic training, which of course includes my own analysis. And I find I have to start this lecture over again. You know, I always tell trainees when they're struggling with their own personal issues, often brought to the surface by analogous conflicts in their patients, no one goes into this field because they had an easy childhood. Almost everyone I know well in the mental health field is a peer, whether they define themselves that way or not. I'm glad I shortened this part, actually. Looking at my own life, the painful and traumatic experiences that my parents suffered through their childhood, they brought into their own parenting. So, as so many do, my brother and I struggled to connect as well as part of the same family dynamic. And while our family functioned, we were all very lonely in our own way. And when I read I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, a few things stand out, I think, in retrospect. What I had thought of for my whole life as an intellectual interest in how people might experience and live in alternate realities, I now see as an effort to join with and understand my family. And perhaps also to understand myself, because I still remember a time of magic in my childhood, when my imagination could feel so strong and evocative that it pulled my sense of reality with it. And what I had thought was an interest in how words can heal, I now think was actually a deep reverberation with the power of true connection, true seeing and knowing of another person. Words were the conduit of both the connection and the retelling, but the power lay beneath the words. When I was in my undergraduate studies, I got the opportunity to shadow some psychiatrists on inpatient units where I met a young woman with psychosis. She was my age, she was beautiful and smart, and her psychotic symptoms were tormenting her. She got quickly better with olanzapine. She was discharged. It felt like magic, a magic I was still allowed to believe in. I was hooked. I knew I had chosen the right career path. I never got to see her again, to see how long the magic held, or to learn what it might have cost her. After many years in practice, I now know those magic cures tend to dissipate, and the cost of high-dose medications is a very high price indeed. On that same rotation, a psychiatrist I shadowed rounded on patients by having the nurses bring the patient into the room. He would sit at a great distance across from them, and the patient stood as though giving a speech in school. "How are you doing today?" he asked each one. As soon as they began talking about their alternate experience of reality, he would interrupt them by saying, "Okay, that's enough for today." He was done. He had no interest in hearing more. All he needed to know was that they were still willing to talk about a non-consensual experience of reality. From his perspective, it was time to increase the medication dose. Sadly, though that memory is now over 20 years old, that approach is still a common one. There is no curiosity there, only a wish to cure. Through residency in my early years of practice, I also became, or so I thought, an excellent psychopharmacologist, and I wielded those magic medications like scalpels. But my heart wasn't in it. After a few years of treating what felt like the end stage of a disease, when I treated veterans with 20 plus years of schizophrenia, I began a first episode psychosis program in Philadelphia. I imagined we were catching this disease of, and I have to put this in quotations, schizophrenia, at the beginning. We included a type of CBT in our treatment model, which made us progressive in the treatment of psychosis, at least for America. But our CBT model taught patients and their families that psychosis is an obstacle to be overcome, something to develop coping strategies for, something to learn to ignore. There was nothing in there about making meaning, but there was meaning to be made. The people I saw were tormented with meaning as yet unmetabolized. The young man who was raised by a strong single mother, now dying of cancer, who told me he was a woman too and his penis was his tail. The boy who was adopted out of a third world country by a Christian family who believed in good works, but perhaps not in him, who thought he was Jesus. More prophets, more demons, more confusion, more conflation, more exaggeration and catastrophe, but meaning all around in every turn of phrase, in every metaphorical turned literal. And what I had blithely thought was the start of the illness, because it was the start of psychotic symptoms, quickly revealed itself to already be end-stage trauma and attachment issues for young teenagers who needed our early intervention 5 years earlier, 10 years earlier. It was also not my job to really talk with patients. Academically, I was expected to run programs and centers with a 10,000-foot view. Clinically, I was supposed to work at the top of my license, which meant brief medication management appointments that left me fumbling in the dark about why things got better or worse in a person's life, and how I was meant to help them with only medications in my tool belt. And so in 2020, I left the programs, the academic institution, and my entire career up until that point. Instead, I started a practice where I could spend more time with people with diagnoses of psychosis beyond the 20 or 30-minute medication appointment. And I started analytic training. Psychoanalysis is, at least for me, a practice of working with metaphor. Through the training, I began to see how I had diminished the awesome power of the metaphorical mind into neurotransmitters and white matter in an effort to convince myself that I had grasped the ineffable. And soon enough, I came to see that I had traded one language of metaphor for another, the metaphor of magic and symbols for the metaphor of neurotransmitters and white matter. Both an effort at explanation, neither one sufficient. Like the blind men and the elephant, we, the clinicians and scientists, observed without understanding. Neither dopamine nor white matter tracts explained why, how, and what meaning was communicated in the so-called psychotic symptoms. Importantly, I would like to acknowledge that there are many people suffering because of psychosis who find their symptoms traumatic and damaging. Many people come into treatment desperate for help. And having treated people for over 20 years, I can also attest that for many people, medications do work, especially to reduce the more distressing symptoms. And for many people, those medications are treatment enough. Not everyone wants therapy. And furthermore, many people don't want to coexist with their symptoms. They want them gone. And for some people, medications will do that, and they are content to move on with their lives without further exploration. And also, there are many people who do want to better understand what happened in their lives to bring them to this place and what this place means to them. Or the medications only partially work and they find themselves needing another avenue to healing. In either instance, I want to acknowledge the pain that people find themselves in and to clarify that for many people, psychiatric help is life-saving, even in its current flawed iteration. The antipsychotic medications do work, at least for many. The problem with them is that psychiatrists and patients alike must choose which deal with the devil are you willing to make in terms of the side effects. Are you going to get the weight gain and high cholesterol? Would you prefer to feel stiff, rigid, and tremulous? What about an inner feeling of restlessness, so insistent that you will walk until the soles of your feet are bleeding? Seizures, metabolic syndrome, sudden muscle cramps that tighten a muscle so dramatically that you cannot relax it without medication. How about your eyes rolling up to the sky, no matter what you may be doing, including driving? What about permanent, disfiguring movements that will mark you as strange and abnormal, even long after the psychosis is gone? And perhaps the worst of it, and the least discussed, at least in my old circles, the loss of the pleasure chemical, dopamine. I always ask the residents I train, do you like pleasure? Do you like the anticipation of pleasure? If yes, then you like dopamine. What do you think it feels like when we block nearly 100% of someone's dopamine? Is that how you would like to spend the rest of your life? And yet, the current standard of care in psychiatry states that the dose that got a patient into remission should be the maintenance dose for life. Since we know that managed care has shortened inpatient stays to days instead of weeks, but it takes weeks for medication doses to show their true effect, people's medication doses get increased for the sedative properties more so than the antipsychotic benefits on inpatient units. Often, outpatient psychiatrists are afraid to then lower the doses because of the standard of care dictum I mentioned earlier, that the dose that gets a patient well should be continued indefinitely for life. For life. Standard of care is antipsychotic treatment, likely at a high dose, for life. This treatment, as usual, leaves patients on high doses of medications with little or no effort to reduce doses. And as I mentioned earlier, therapy is considered progressive, not standard of care. So for many, the current mental health treatment model is medication at doses that leave people susceptible to terrible side effects with little to no therapy. And when symptoms recur or don't improve, there's no avenue for understanding why or why not, only another dose increase. And there are, I believe, other less conscious reasons for high doses of medications in the absence of clear benefit. Despite my reservations about the treatment of psychosis in the United States, I know from experience that the treaters themselves, the psychiatrists, the nurses, and the therapists, are mostly empathic, caring people who want to help and want to believe that they are helping. If this is true, why is the help so frequently harmful? I suspect that one of the reasons the help is harmful is because of the inherent slipperiness of reality, because of how very difficult it can be for people, even professionals, or maybe especially professionals, to sit with other people's experience of reality, one that drastically differs from one's own, and not vigorously defend against it. The discomfort associated with listening to an alternate reality is visceral. It disorients us. It makes us angry. What is at stake? In my experience working with people with alternative realities, the stakes are as high as any. For those on both sides of the treatment experience, the stakes are existence versus annihilation. For all of us, reality is tenuous at best. Phones ring when there is silence, shadows, or strangers in the dark. People are too interested in our business. The laugh that quickly quieted was at our expense. We are constantly trying to bolster our own shaky reality. Little do most of us realize that none of us have access to true reality. The best we can hope for is a stable, consensual reality that everyone experiences in more or less the same way. I think the last 8 years or so of living in the United States has by now convinced us that people can live in very different consensual realities from one another. Physicians choose their specialties carefully, strategically, and unconsciously. As I was drawn to psychosis to connect with members of my family, other researchers and clinicians have their own dynamic minds at work directing their career paths. For many, there are unconscious struggles with reality that guide their hand. In many cases, like the attending I shadowed over 20 years ago, there is a wish to cure their own beloved family member, maybe, or themselves. And for many, to cure means to control. There is no room for open-ended curiosity if the goal is eradication. And eradication of all psychotic symptoms is an agreed upon goal of most American researchers and clinicians. So then there is no point, no interest, no room for understanding. I've heard more than one prominent psychiatrist talk without irony about how helpful it would be to implant a tracking device in patients so that they can be found when they are at their most ill and brought into care. For these providers, the wish to control in an effort to cure is in full force in their unconscious. They see this wish as an effort to treat benignly, although to myself, and I think many in this audience, that effort is deeply misguided. Beyond the white knuckle efforts to control and eradicate, to sit without judgment with those whose views of reality clash with our own is to throw ourselves into existential chaos. Sitting in an office with just the treatment provider and the patient, two versions of reality are at war with one another. It can be overwhelming to hear, let alone allow, an experience of reality so at odds with our own, to acknowledge that perhaps there are angels and demons, malevolent FBI agents, beings from other planets with malintent, fiery pits of hell into which we might all fall. A chance to accept the Messiah sitting across from us is to open ourselves to such a discordant view of the world as to leave us dizzy and untethered. To lose our grip on our own reality would be to descend into chaos, to dissolve into the universe around us, to disappear. This annihilation anxiety we defend against is the very same one that plagues our patients and leads them to develop their own strongly held convictions about what is real. I suspect that this is what leads psychiatrists like the one I encountered during my undergraduate years to end the conversation after hearing any psychotic content. What must be so frightening to that doctor that he can't hear even a sliver of psychotic thought without shutting it down? His access to that fear was deeply buried, I suspect. But I believe that any such dense othering of people is always driven by fear. There's a term in psychoanalysis called projective identification. It refers to the power of one person's unconscious to project certain unwanted feelings and thoughts into another person. The person on the receiving end, well, receives the projection and starts to play it out. Like a lock into a key, the projection finds a willing home in the recipient and the dance begins, each participant already unconsciously knowing the steps. We all do this more or less. It is not the bastion of those with experiences we call psychosis. In fact, though often hard to see, projective identification is subtly at work in many relationships we have, sometimes strengthening them, sometimes testing them. In the treater-patient relationship, these unconscious dances become at times both rigid and frenetic. When therapists and physicians have the time and training to pick these patterns up, the dance can slow down, the steps be examined, and the two can return to the dance floor with a more natural rhythm, the unconscious spell broken. When providers have only 20 minutes every month or two with someone, these dances are neither noticed nor examined, only acted out upon the dance floor as the pair circle each other more and more rigidly. In particular, I suspect that in the treatment of people with alternate realities, physicians are especially prone to identify unconsciously with the person's own experience of annihilation anxiety, which awakens their own. Then, like the patient has projected into them, the physician reacts with unconscious rage and need to eliminate the anxiety to shut it down. The analogy is striking. The patient is othered because of a set of false beliefs, a false reality. This reality is often generated in an effort to manage the patient's terrible anxiety. But at the same time, the physician is also gathering around them a false belief in the reified metaphors of the brain, the veracity of the diagnoses, and the healing power of the medications to quell their own existential anxiety. The energy of these competing realities can create a maelstrom in the therapeutic relationship. When a tornado passes, one house may be in tatters, while the neighbors is spared. In this storm, it is almost always the patient who is shattered and the provider whose own brittle reality is spared. In other words, in the hands of doctors too afraid of the abyss of uncertain reality, Medications become another tool to erect a barrier between us and them. And the more the patient damages us by insisting that reality is an amorphous concept that neither of us can truly access, the higher the doses of medication, and perhaps the greater the unconscious punishment. How else to account for patients left to flounder on enormous doses of medication in the absence of clear benefit, in the presence of clear harm? Sitting in a space without judgment is a hard thing to allow, but without finding a way to be brave enough to acknowledge in ourselves the unknown, we leave those we profess to treat in the isolation of their own existential anxiety. I personally find this the hardest part of my job. Sometimes it's manageable, especially in times of calmer discussion. The patient and I can agree to acknowledge that we both don't know for sure what is real, and then work together from there. This work feels mutual and consensual, if not easy. Sometimes in my work, the person in front of me is demanding and insistent. I must see things their way. I must not only declare my belief in their reality, but act accordingly. Their demands might feel dangerous to me, putting me in the realm of malpractice or putting the patient at risk, at least in my opinion. These situations test my ability to hold space for someone else's experience. I continue to work on this in myself. And sometimes my patients open my eyes. Spiritual experiences, government conspiracies, unexplained phenomena. I've learned things from patients by being curious. Doors once closed to me have opened again. Ideas I once dismissed, I now let linger. This is difficult work too. But whether the work of being with someone in their reality is easy or hard, I hold steadfast to this conviction. Medication should be used with caution and at the smallest doses, as the costs of high-dose medication are as great or greater than that of an unshared reality. And as physicians and other prescribers, we need to open our eyes to the possibility that we unconsciously use medications punitively to punish those we cannot control, who awaken our own annihilation anxiety. If that is so, we must be so very careful to use the lowest dose and to ask ourselves difficult questions about the locus of the anxiety when we feel the urge to increase the dose again. The question we must ask ourselves is, whose anxiety am I treating? I cannot wish or will my family story to have been different, and acknowledging certain truths in my own therapy has meant confronting and letting go of many fantasies about my family and myself that have brought me comfort. But it is everything that came before that unconsciously guided me to this place, working with people with alternative experiences of reality, allowing a suspension of my own perceived reality, traveling alongside a companion, not an expert. This work of being curious, of sitting in the unknown, is the hardest work I have ever done. But I hope the people I treat will come to benefit from my efforts to tolerate my own anxiety with their experience of reality.